they did a really lighthearted, like kind of ironic Metal Gear movie, that could be cool.
Yeah,
Very okay. Haven't
have
had
the
Pop Tarts before. We got to
have all the
change that. We got
major
to change
ironic
that. All right. How do you guys eat your Pop Tarts? I'm curious.
superhero or not
Do you
superhero
eat it out the
action
bag?
heroes that
You know,
like the
fresh
Rock and
raw.
John Cena and whatnot in it.
Yeah. Anything that's not the fucking Mortal Kombat movie
Ready?
from a few months
Get
ago. Because
set.
the originals are fantastic
Action.
because they knew they were
We
corny
will use
and
our
they doubled down on it.
Right, and the games back then were corny is
Oh,
AF
yeah.
too.
If you enjoy corny cinema, my favorite.
Hello, and welcome to Gamers for Peace, an initiative of Veterans for Peace. We are a group of anti war veterans and allies who are speaking out against military recruitment to kids in gaming and streaming. This is our Mental Health Monday stream, where we discuss topics related to veterans, mental health, and substance use. We work to create an inclusive gaming and streaming environment, and we hope to have open discussions about the realities of military recruiting, service, and war. My name's Phoenix. I'm an Army vet, served as an intel analyst, did one tour in Afghanistan in 2008, joined Veterans for Peace about a year and a half ago now, so it's been a little bit, and kind of been active ever since. I am joined by a whole panel tonight, super excited for everything that we got going on. Why don't I pass it to Krios, and we'll just kind of go around that way.
Hey guys, thanks again for having me on the program. Always a pleasure being here. Super excited for today. It marks a very big anniversary, which I won't go into. I'll let our special guests explain that. Not necessarily a good anniversary, but a big anniversary. So I look forward to chatting with you all and hearing what our guest has to say and offer for us. Oh, am I muted? No.
Nope, you're good. Hey, I'm Haas. I'm an ally here for Veterans for Peace. I've been streaming here for the past couple months now. Really enjoying the initiative. Also, really jealous of how cozy Phoenix's blanket looks right now.
Oh yeah, I forgot I was still
Wishing-
wearing it.
Yeah, I wish it was cold enough here for me to wear
Should I
one.
bust my
Sweating in
snuggie
my other
out
part.
too?
Yeah.
Do it. This thing's great. It's like a poncho thing that my mother got me because I was
Looks
actually
cool.
jealous she had one.
But yeah, really excited for the conversation tonight. I think it's going to be awesome. We have a very educated guest here and looks so forward to what they have to say. But before that, I'll pass it over to Poisson.
Hi everybody, my name is Poisson Mushroom, Justin. I use he/him pronouns, and I was a veteran of the Army for 7 years. I did a 9-month deployment to Iraq. I did another deployment in Poland in 19. I just got out of the Army in March, and it was kind of just, being in the Army kind of led me to realize it's bad. That's why I'm here with Veterans for Peace, to bring my perspective as an anti-war veteran to help also reach out to people who might be thinking about joining, might be considering that as a career option. I'm here to kind of give you, hey, the other perspective the recruiters won't tell you. And I guess I'll pass it over to our guest.
Oh, geez. Thank you. Thanks, Justin, for roping me into this whole thing. You guys are a bunch of sweeties and cuties. Looking forward to this. My name's Haley. You may know me from, I don't know, constantly being canceled on Twitter or talking about MILFs. But in real life, when I'm not doing that, I am an aspiring historian. I study under a man named Peter Kuznick, who is one of the more, if not the most prominent, nuclear historians in the world. Works with Oliver Stone, and I think his movies are a great resource too. But so I kind of focus in 20th century history, specifically Cold War history, and I have done a lot of research on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is both myself and Peter's main crusade in life. I got the privilege to go on a peace tour of Japan and attend, I guess, the 72nd anniversary ceremonies for the bombings, and that coupled with studying under Peter for years and years really changed my life and helped me understand just how important these events, knowing the truth of these events are, because my kind of hypothesis that I try to put out when I talk about it is that a lot of the myths of the United States' dominance during the 20th century are wrapped up, and a lot of the justification for the actions that they took are wrapped up in this narrative of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, as I know now through my studies, are false. So it's really important, and I know how annoying it is for a lot of us just to see people argue about dead people all the time on the timeline. I mean, I love that shit, and I still get annoyed with it. But this is one of those things that is really actually important to dismantle. And hopefully, if you don't agree with me, maybe you'll start kind of understand why as I talk more about it. But thank you for having me on here.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Cool. We're super excited to have you today. Oh, did we just get a follow? Is that what that tone means?
Oh, I just started hosting the channel. Sorry.
Oh, you got me excited. I thought Sin had it set up for some tones.
Oh, no, there was a follow.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Right on, yeah.
Thank you,
Techno.
Techno.
I cannot talk today.
Definitely support these lads.
One of the first things I wanted to ask you, just to get the ball rolling a little bit, is what drew you to this field of study? Why do this?
I've always been interested in World War II history specifically. I was that guy growing up. You know the type. There's World War II kids, there's Rome kids. When you study history, and it only becomes more of a meme as you go through school and do it. But always really loved history. I was also really obsessed with the 1960s. I'm a total boomer when it comes to music taste. I'm a wannabe hippie, so that was my whole thing. And as I kind of hit a wall studying that stuff, I was like, why didn't the counter revolution pan out? What happened here? Where'd the peace and love go? It really kind of prompted me to look more critically at these things. I started out as an anthropology major, actually, because I was frustrated with how history was told in high school. So I thought maybe I'll go look at the more cultural aspect. But then I pivoted back to history. I still draw a lot from both fields. But what brought me to this event specifically, I really didn't have strong feelings towards it. And maybe you guys can relate to this, but I was kind of, beyond vaguely like understanding it to be, if not a necessary thing, then at least a tragic thing. Um, I watched a documentary, which my mentor made with Oliver Stone, called The Untold History of the United States. And they have an episode on the atomic bombings. And this is like probably the most mainstream depiction of like this alternative take on that event. And it completely just like shattered my view, because I didn't really know much about it beyond like, oh, it was sad, a lot of people died, like, and then that pretty much single-handedly turned me into like a militant nuclear abolitionist. And I've only studied more since. So I just showed that the other day in my Discord. It's free on Vimeo. That entire documentary series is like a great teaching resource. But yeah, that's what brought me into it, is my mentor in that project specifically.
Yeah, that's awesome. And if Haas at some point or something can find a link to that Vimeo, it looked like you were working on that. I'd appreciate it, and we can link that in the chat so people can check it out a little bit later. So, I want to comment that, sometimes it's easier for people that don't have that direct experience to help advocate, because they can say the words that other people are having trouble saying. And so that's why it's important, even if you don't have necessarily a personal experience with whatever event, to still be that advocate, to help be that voice a little bit, because it is really difficult for people who have that direct connection to recount and rehash and re-go over these things over and over and over, and have that trigger and that trauma continue to pop up for them. So it's really great to hear that you're able to be that person for a whole hundreds of thousands of people at this point, because I know that the lasting effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in terms of the nuclear fallout that it caused, and the long-term effects of the genetic deformities that some Japanese people have experienced, can be traumatic in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, it is our job as historians to get the big idea across. We don't expect, like, actual in Japan, they're called hibakusha, the bomb victims. We don't expect them to do all the legwork themselves, and and yeah, it is traumatizing to constantly have to bring that up, to negotiate your existence to a world that is largely uncaring. That's brutal. So of course I want to like be there and do that for them. I'm personal friends with a couple bomb survivors after traveling there. So I really do it for them. But the thing about nuclear stuff is that it's an issue. It's Damocles' sword hanging over all of humanity. Like, it's really about all of us when it comes down to it. So this is something that everybody should be concerned about. So yeah.
Yeah, I was reading an interesting article today that, even if less than 1% of the nuclear bombs that are currently in existence were used, it would cause an entire global fallout, like an entire
a nuclear
global disaster.
winter.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer, like a year into the Manhattan Project, was already starting to warn against the dangers of the bomb, because he theorized correctly that within 3 to 5 years, the bombs that they had would grow exponentially in size and capability. And he theorized that the bombs could potentially be like 10 to 100 times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima. And he turned out to be right. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviets got one in 53. So this power is growing exponentially. The delivery systems, right, what we attach warheads to shoot them at other people, are only getting more streamlined and more powerful and farther reaching. So yeah, it's, I believe, about a dozen of the bombs that we had, say like India and Pakistan had a limited nuclear exchange out of about a dozen nukes, that could trigger a nuclear winter, which could kill hundreds of thousands of people. Just that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really all or nothing with these weapons, and that's what I hope you guys take away from this a little bit, is that there is no such thing as a safe or moral or limited nuclear war, because the destruction it wreaks is all encompassing.
Yeah. So we. Oh, thanks for the follow.
Oh, and I guess I should proceed. I mean, I don't think anything I'm going to be talking about is specifically like gory or graphic. I will be talking about a couple like victims' direct experiences, but just I guess content warning, trigger warning for just this is going to be a heavy talk. Like it is
Right.
what it is. I encourage you guys to stick through it if you can, because I try to wrap it up in an optimistic way, and I think we all have a responsibility to kind of talk about this. But it will get heavy, so just bear that in mind. I appreciate everyone choosing
Yeah.
to do this on their Sunday night. Just hear some of the most depressing shit ever.
Yeah, I appreciate the trigger warning too, and keeping in mind, so like this is our Mental Health Monday stream, so a little bit of a different perspective that we kind of wanted to take with this is focusing on the mental health of not only the victims but the perpetrators too, who had a hand in making this tragic event a reality. So the first question actually came from Pasan. Um, and I love how you worded this because it takes into account both of those kind of perspectives that I was just talking about. And so it says the question is, or do you want to read it, Pasano? I can let you ask it.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it.
Okay.
All right, so for the first question I wrote here, I said, let me just actually, Phoenix, why don't you go ahead and read it, because I'm having issues when I try and open another window.
So it says not to emphasize or put the focus on U.S. military personnel, but as a veteran of this, the United States Army, I'm curious as to the psychological toll this took on servicemen who directly worked with the Manhattan Project. How did this affect the pilots? And Passan mentioned that he's heard rumors that the Army issued potent narcotics to the pilots before they flew their missions. And if there's any truth to this, and what emotions did people express? So, do you know about the history of the people that dropped the bomb?
Yeah, absolutely. And your very last question about the narcotics, I broke off into a separate one that I'll get to. But I actually wanted to open with a little anecdote that kind of answers this question, and then I'll get into more quotes and stuff. But so if you are familiar with some of the literature around the atomic bombings, the book by John Hersey called Hiroshima is probably the most famous one, and a man named Reverend Tanimoto features heavily in that book. He was famous for popularizing the "No More Hiroshimas" slogan, and he's chronicled in the book, and for his work with the Hiroshima Maidens, who were a group of extremely disfigured women who were victims of the bombings. In 1955, Reverend Tanimoto took his Hiroshima maidens and his young daughter Coco to the United States so that the maidens could get reconstructive surgery and some medical treatment. And he was invited on a very popular primetime TV show called This Is Your Life. And at the very end of the show, the host brings out a surprise guest, and his name is Captain Robert Lewis, who is co-pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Now, a lot of people took this favorably. They thought it was kind of cool. It was a nice kumbaya moment. Other people were horrified. But Coco, who was 10 years old when she came to America and was on this show, although she was shocked by the meeting, and I've met Coco in person. She's one of the survivors I'm close with. I just wanted to, if I like talk overly familiar about her, that's why. But Coco was shocked by having this man brought up in front of her out of nowhere that caused her and her family and her community such mass suffering. But she said she started to see the whole thing differently after seeing tears in Captain Lewis's eyes, and she said she understood in a way that he was a victim too of like an inhuman industrial complex. But I mean, the bombings absolutely took a psychological toll on the people involved, whether they admitted it publicly or not. And you'll see a lot that people may allude to perhaps the bombs not being strategically necessary, or oh, it was a shame we had to drop them, but we had to drop them. Far fewer people are going to admit outright that they regret their decision or, really strongly speak out against it. I don't know if you guys can attest to this being in the service, but I think they really kind of drill you with don't worry about morality so much, like, because then
Yes.
you'll
Yeah.
start to go crazy. Is that
Yeah,
true?
that's
Like,
yeah, that's absolutely true. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there,
No,
but it was like
go ahead.
no, it's absolutely true because since the mental health podcast, I had a suicide attempt when I was in the army, went to behavioral health obviously, and that's one of the things I brought up was like I was feeling a lot of guilt over experiences I had on deployment and things that I saw, right? And that's what the PA, the doctor said to me. He's like, "Oh, you didn't do that. Like, it was a general who signed off on that. Like, you're just a guy who
Right.
fixed a network, right?" So yeah, like you're absolutely right. They do tell you that in the service.
Yeah, some banality of evil shit. But
Yeah.
so though their willingness to accept responsibility for their actions is pretty evenly split, 5 out of 6 5-star generals in World War II who got their 5th star during the war have publicly stated that the atomic bombings were either unnecessary, immoral, or both. Admiral William Leahy, who is the chief of staff, described the bomb as a violation of every Christian ethic and all the laws of war.
Wow.
And he later said in private that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material use in the war against Japan. I was not taught to make war in that fashion. Wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. And another reason why World War II is historically significant is because it's the real, like, institutionalization of psychological warfare, like as a legitimate tactic. You see bombing civilians a little bit in World War One, but it really becomes like common practice in World War II. And you see when you study it, the tension between some of the older heads, some of the veterans of like the Spanish American War, things that are even older, who were kind of appalled and confused by this insistence on like terror bombing and just like the changing state of war. And that's something that I think people don't take away as much from World War II, is that it mattered so much in that regard, because we're still, this is just how we do war even today. I mean, we have drones now, but we don't.
Right.
We'll bomb weddings. We'll bomb whatever. We'll bomb civilians and not lose a wink of sleep. So keep that in the back of your mind. A philosopher named Gunther Anders coined the term Promethean gap to describe the cascade of technological advances that made warfare exponentially deadlier. And many Manhattan Project scientists, as I mentioned, were aware of at least the hypothetical dangers of the bomb. Oppenheimer, a year or two into the project, said he was calling for an end to the project, saying, "Better to live in thraldom to the Nazis than to bring down the final curtain on mankind." And this guy was no like a Nazi lover. He was a Jewish man, and he was very much at certain times he was very pro actually using the bombs, but he also realized that the process that would set in motion was beyond anyone's control, right? Because you're dealing with power that is honestly an affront to God. Like no one person should be able to wield the capability to just wipe an entire city out of existence. But I digress.
Yeah.
There's other notable figures who resisted, including Claude Etherly. Etherly was piloting a weather bomber right before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima, so he didn't witness the bombings or drop it personally, but he was complicit, and it caused him an immense amount of grief. He was in and out of VA psych wards, and for like a couple decades after his service, went on strings of petty crime sprees and kind of became like this media darling because people were just confused at how a decorated, veteran became a petty criminal. He was arrested and put on trial for I believe, breaking into a post office. His psychiatrist asserted that he suffered from a guilt complex, and he was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. And this was a very high-profile trial.
Wow.
He also attempted suicide at least twice, and he died in 1978. I think he was 59 of throat cancer, but he was by far the most outspoken critic of anyone directly involved in the bombings of these events, and he was probably the only person out of the 90 or so crew to explicitly say, I regret my decision. Not that, oh, it was a shame, but I regret my decision and what I did was wrong. Pilots, and it wasn't just the like people love to bring up when I talk about the bombings, oh, what about the fire bombings? They were awful too. They fucked up a lot of people too, both on the ground and psychologically, the people who were forced to carry that out.
Right.
Still one of like the most deadliest like lost my train of thought there. But so pilots who participated in the March 9th firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 were called vomiting from the overpowering stench of burning flesh at 10,000 feet.
Jesus.
And then, actually, this is about the atomic bombings themselves, but Paul Tibbets, who is one of the co-pilots, reenacted the atomic bombing at an air show in Texas in like the 70s, like, which is just sick to think about. But yeah, a lot of the sentiment among the higher ups in the army was kind of like a righteous Christian one, right? Because they were conflicted about like the changing nature of war. They felt like alienated. They weren't going to say outright that the mission was bad because they wanted to protect their boys and their own, kind of conscience, but
yeah,
they were conflicted. You can at least say that.
I wish we had Plantifa on. I wish I would have thought about that because she does a lot of research in just war theory, and she does our military ad slams on Fridays, which are great. Highly recommend watching them. But when you think about incorporating just war theory into the bombs, what you're really talking about is a lot of people are not in agreement that it was like this morally, like even in any kind of terms of like ending conflict quicker.
Yeah.
Killing hundreds of thousands of civilians is not a way to do that.
Absolutely. And I want to make it clear that there was never a consensus around the decision to drop the bomb. There was internal criticism and resistance before, during, and after the bombings, and the narrative of it being justified and kind of a Herculean effort, and everybody came together and thought this was cool and the right thing to do. That's a post hoc revision of history. And I will, if we have time, I might get more into like the decision to drop the bomb, kind of break that down.
Yeah.
But that is something that could take hours just on its own. But we want to focus on the psychology a little bit first.
Yeah.
And then try to go from there.
Go
ahead.
Sorry, I keep trying to jump in. You're so good. And
I'm sorry.
Such a great storyteller
No,
that
please stop
I don't
me
want
at
to
any
interrupt.
time.
I know. As Veterans for Peace, we do talk a lot about moral injury as one of the major side effects of service, and the moral injury that you're describing from not even people, not just the pilots, but people who saw the events, people who ordered the events, people who knew the event was happening, all these people living with that moral injury, that regret. It definitely, and you said this gentleman was diagnosed with like an extreme guilt by a psychologist.
Yeah, right, because you also have to consider that around the time of World War II, this is when we still called PTSD shell shock. And like after World War II, it became impossible to not grapple with like the psychological effects of war, but they didn't have the language for it. So yeah, they just said he was suffering from acute guilt. They didn't have a term to really. Now we know it as post-traumatic stress, and it's still hardly been studied, but yeah.
Well, and we talk about how post-traumatic stress and moral injury manifest very similarly, but at their core have different treatment methods, because moral injury isn't necessarily a diagnosable term. It's not in the DSM, but the research that's showing is that there is a moral conundrum that has gone awry. PTSD The major difference is that it's mostly like an event that's just kind of outside your control, that you wish you had better navigated, and that you constantly reflect on how you better could have navigated that or what should have happened. Doesn't always have to have that moral piece, but moral injury is very unique in that aspect. Is like there is something that you feel an extreme amount of guilt about,
Yeah.
that you either participated or let happen or saw it or something that you feel you were complicit in.
Right. That term is new to me. That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to look more into that. Oh, go ahead.
There's a great book that I've been reading called After War by Nancy Sherman. She's a little bit more pro-military than than I am, but she does a great job of explaining these major differences and using just war theory, because understanding just war theory does come into understanding moral injury. Because, you know, like you said, what you're describing is like all these people that were conflicted about this bomb because it's an affront to God, and that like no one should have this amount of power in and of itself is that moral conflict with just war theory.
Yeah. That's so interesting. On the other side of that, right, you have the perpetrators experiencing this moral injury, and there's some psychologists have proposed kind of almost like an existential injury in survivors of the bomb, because when you see such mass suffering inflicted by humans, man-made suffering, it almost caused them to like psychologically buy out of like just the entire like almost social contract, like the way society is ordered, because you see people on the street, you assume they're a good person, you want to talk to them, you want to be their friend, like it just goes against every like human like tendency that we have to like see something like that happen. And then how can you continue about your day, or how can you not call into question like every single thing about the way the world turns, you know? So that's really, I think that's like an interesting foil to that. But let me just talk a little bit more about, and please feel free to check me on time. We can move to other questions or bring up audience questions. But I just wanted to talk again about the fire bombings, which really did like legitimize psychological warfare. We saw that it was not working, but we saw that it was doing something to the Japanese population, because we firebombed over 100 cities, causing near or total destruction. And you have to understand that these were mostly paper cities. Tokyo was called a paper city. These were cities made out of bamboo that just went up like that. The city of Toyama was 99.5% destroyed. Like, think about the city or town that you're in right now, and think about that 99.5% destroyed. By mid 1945, we ran out of military targets to bomb. On the eve of Hiroshima, there are only 10 cities in all of Japan that had not, with over 100,000 people, that had not been bombed, and 5 of which were specifically reserved as atomic bomb targets, and that's why they weren't bombed. So it's just like so deeply evil to think about. But the military felt that they needed mass terror to demoralize the Japanese, that they had very racist, kind of dehumanizing notions about, right? MacArthur said, all would fight to die like ants. And people widely regarded the emperor as like a godlike figure. So they said, okay, well, we're dealing with an extremely committed enemy here, and we need to try something different. Did it work? I argue not, but according to a confidential memo from Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, the U.S. bombing campaign against Japan was one of the most ruthless and barbaric killings of non-combatants in all of history. And now it's par for the course.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and I think about how Americans are so much more disconnected from these kind of events, because that's not something in American history that we've really experienced, right? So the major wars, World War I, World War II, you know, the major bombing on U.S. soil that people can think about, of course, is Pearl Harbor. And that's really the biggest one. And that was a military target. So there's not been this carpet bombing of civilians in the United States. And we have that privilege in the United States. And there's I think that's what helps create this disconnect, especially now for today's wars. We don't have this civilian connection to people who are combating the wars currently. You have
Yeah.
people that don't even realize that we still have troops in Iraq and Afghanistan that finally left. So for 20 years, people didn't know what was happening. At least during the World War One and World War Two, you had this civilian effort into at least like manufacturing and things like that. People saw loved ones go. There's just not that kind of connection anymore.
Absolutely. Like the whole siege mentality is really foreign to Americans. Like that's something that Vietnamese people and Russian people understand very well, like undergoing just a series of revolutions and wars at the will of other countries.
Yeah.
That's something we've never really had to reckon with. And even Pearl Harbor was used to, you know, some historians have described like the kind of cultural bloodlust that Americans experienced as Pearl Harbor syndrome, or Stalin and the Soviet Union had Barbarossa syndrome. But yeah, we can't. It's not really comparable to things that these other countries experienced.
Yeah.
We do have a couple questions from the chat, if that's okay, Phoenix.
Yeah, hit me.
Yeah.
So for the first one, has the official U.S. government position on whether they were justified changed at all since the bombings?
Not really, no. I mean, so a lot of the documents that I cite that here's the thing with countering this narrative, right? The lie is easy, the explanation or the counter is very difficult. A lot of the documents that I cite are available on like government websites that allude to, you know, Truman knowing that he was killing civilians and feeling bad about it, and that they knew that the war would have ended with just the Soviet, like things like that. But the stance has not really changed that much, and all we could really manage to do is make symbolic gestures. So the first president to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki was Jimmy Carter, but he was not a sitting president at that point. But he visited in, I want to say the 90s, but I'm not sure. So that was a big deal symbolically. That was like a gesture of goodwill, but did it really amount to anything? And Obama actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for a speech he made in Prague about denuclearization, but he was the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And even though going there was a big deal, that's one of the, like the few things I will give him credit for. He was still using like passive language to kind of distance himself and America from like direct responsibility for the bombings. He said, you know, on August 6th, death fell from the sky. It's like, no, Truman gave the order to, you know, incinerate 110,000 people. Like, you know, so
Right.
yes and no, but there's also like no, you can't just look up on like a .gov and be like, hey, did they think the bombings were good? You kind of have to dig for anything about this.
Yeah, pretty much the standard American denial of we did it, but we don't talk about it.
Right, yeah. And you have to think about like, why don't we celebrate VJ Day? Like, why don't we celebrate the end of World War II at all? Because to invite more study into that narrative that we say, oh, we won World War II in equal part, or we won the war in Japan because of the atomic bombings. It's like when that's met with any sort of analysis, it immediately falls apart. And then, like I tried to say, like so much about history just, it's like a domino effect. It's dangerous to like look at that closely. So we don't really, and we lost significantly less people in World War II, sure, but like you would think that the most like patriotic, brainwashed, propagandistic like society on earth would try to play that up a little bit more, and there's a reason why we avoid it. At least I think so.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think I don't know if I want to go down to this topic, but I think they say that we bomb. I think the main defense I hear is that we bombed so that we didn't send 70,000 troops. Or like that was the cost estimate of loss of life were we to invade, and this was the easier justification, and completely leaves the Soviet Union invading Manchuria and potentially Japan off the board.
Well, and then you're also equating, when you bring in just war theory, right?
Yeah.
Equating civilian lives and combatant lives, right? So like,
Right.
you know, this woman or child had nothing, wouldn't have done anything, could not have done anything to cause direct harm, more than likely. And, you know,
Yet,
enemy
they paid the
combatants
price.
at least make that choice.
Yeah,
You know.
that statement being flung around so casually just kind of speaks to like how removed we are from the effects of the bombs, because if you see your own mother turn to charcoal, if you see a building collapse in on a school like full of your fellow students, it's a lot harder to say that, oh, those lives were, liquidated for the greater good. And oh, I'm sorry, what, so you're, can you repeat like the
There wasn't
question?
really a point to the question.
Okay, just
Yeah, I think the answer
short-term
just a
memory loss
discussion.
hitting.
Yeah, no, it's okay. There is another question. It goes a little out of the scope of the conversation, but I am just curious to hear your thoughts on it. How close were Germany and Russia to having a bomb by the time that we deployed ours? And do you think they would have used one? I know that's a difficult topic to prove because it's just the endless what if of history.
Yeah.
Right.
So the Manhattan Project was started originally as a deterrent to a potential Nazi bomb, right? The uranium atom is split in 1938. Fleeing European scientists tried to warn FDR about this, tried to warn the US about it because they were terrified. They knew what the Nazis were gearing up for, and wanted them to do something. But FDR didn't really move on it until Albert Einstein wrote him personally and said, you cannot let this happen. We need to build a bomb. We need our own bomb. But the Nazi bomb project, if you know anything about it, really didn't go anywhere. They never really got beyond the fission, or maybe not even the theoretical stage, but it was basically dead in the water because the Nazis were pursuing so many other like initiatives, and they were also getting their asses handed to them. Like after Stalingrad, like they were fighting a defensive war at that point, so they had bigger things to worry about. But yeah, it's actually really funny. If you look up the Nazi bomb project, look up the America bomber. They literally wanted to like Matryoshka doll like a big bomber within a little nuclear bomber, because they didn't have the technology to just get to New York on one tank of gas, but they did want to like nuke New York with like a baby bomber inside a big one. Obviously that was never going to happen, but no, they never got to the point where they had actual nukes or anywhere even close. Russia, on the other hand, was aware of both the British and American bomb projects as early as 1940. If you know about the Rosenbergs, they were providing intel to the Russians from Los Alamos in the early 40s. So they were not quite at the point where anything was viable. God, when was the first? I think the first Russian atomic bomb experiment was in 1946. So really, no probability that that would have been used in the war. And also, Stalin was. So part of my argument is that the atomic bombs were used and their existence alluded to as like a diplomatic playing card. Because Truman wanted a trump card. If you understand anything about the end game of World War II, you know that the Soviets stood to gain the most ground, like by far, and equal, like proportional to their contribution, really. But so Truman wanted to kind of hold on to that, but Stalin actually kind of envisioned that the Grand Alliance would continue and be centered around like nuclear energy, kind of like almost like Atoms for Peace. But he informed George Kennan a little bit after Hiroshima of the existence of the Soviet bomb project as a show of goodwill, because all of the other allies were sharing nuclear secrets. The British, the French, Australians, for some reason, like everybody was keyed into it except for the Soviets. And Stalin was aware of this, felt extremely burned by it, and still thought, hey, I'm really going to try to make this work. Like, this is kind of a way we can form like an international, like, peace building coalition, is through like peaceful proliferation, because he kind of got the sense that this could turn into an arms race. But there was really no chance, no consideration, and no necessity for a Soviet bomb to be dropped. So no on both counts, but the stories are vastly different. The United States was the only country with a viable nuclear weapon at that point.
That's really interesting how you brought up Stalin trying to express a desire for peace, because I think a lot of people probably have a large misconception about that.
Yeah.
And it's really, harking back to what you were mentioning earlier about this, why don't Americans celebrate the end of the war? And we did have Armistice Day at some point, but it, of course, changed to Veterans Day. And, of course, my theory about that, of course, is that it's perpetuated by the military-industrial complex, right? Because if you have a day that celebrates peace, why do you need to make more bombs?
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Right,
also
so
probably
again-
sponsored by Buffalo Wild Wings, because then when you go in there to get your free wings, you order a
Yeah,
bunch
you
of
get your
beer.
10%
My
off.
God.
You get your new vacuum cleaner.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, Armistice was for World War One over two. We
Right.
we don't really want to do
Yeah.
anything with VE or VJ Day.
Right.
Yeah. They say that what is it? World War One was the chemist war, and World War Two was like the physicist war or
Mhm.
something.
Oh.
What's smarter or more destructive than logically applied physics? I don't really want to find out.
Yeah.
I think we're good with just the nuclear issue.
If you have the answer, call 1-888. No.
Raytheon.
Raytheon.
No,
Raytheon.
don't encourage them.
If you want to call Raytheon and just bitch at them, go for it. But
Yeah. But those are both really interesting questions. Let me just wrap up, I guess, like the question we started with was like, how did this psychologically affect like the perpetrators? And I
Right.
will say that like the failure to acknowledge or like understand the struggles of both like Hibakusha and the people complicit in the bombings is like wrapped up in a fundamental disregard for like mental health. Like the First and Second World Wars introduced us to the concept of shell shock, of PTSD, but it's gone mostly not unaddressed or unstudied, but unaddressed by the military, by the U.S. government, almost a century later. And that's a common issue that I see like veterans organizing around, is just that you get kicked to the curb after you serve, and you're afflicted with all of these
My
horrible
final paycheck in
traumas.
March, guess how much that was? It was about $6.34.
Yeah, like sorry you attempted. Here's $7.
Buy a Big Mac.
And fuck you. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and
But-
clearly with our continued bombing campaigns that we, Vietnam, Korea, all of the forever wars in the Middle East, what we did worked.
Yeah.
And the higher ups still loved it, but we've never once
Yeah.
acknowledged the human price of those that we forced to commit those atrocities.
That's actually a great point. Like a lot of the people who were skeptical or critical of the bombings, like MacArthur, Eisenhower, like Curtis fucking LeMay, they went on to advocate for nuking Korea a dozen times, and Vietnam, and all these. So it's not only indicative of just how strong the argument like against the bombings being justified is, but also speaks to that shift in warfare that we're talking about, where like this act like normalized like the mass liquidation of mostly civilians, and we just kind of took it and ran with it, and it's gone largely unquestioned for the better part of a century. And if we understand like the psychic toll that this causes people on either side, like how can it be justified? Like it goes against human nature itself, and that's, I think, why we kind of deliberately avoid talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, and let me just touch on the narcotics question.
Oh yeah.
Were the pilots jacked up on drugs? Answer is yes. So amphetamine use was kind of introduced, and it was encouraged heavily on a voluntary basis from World War II through today.
Oh man.
Adderall is thrown out like candy, at least in the Air Force. I don't know.
Hey, yeah,
Yeah.
no, I could talk at length about
Yeah.
that.
And so abuse was common, and I guess in the Air Force, or if you're doing bombing missions, it's like 12 hours on, 12 hours off. But that rule was commonly broken, right? So you were given amphetamines to like stay alert on your mission, and then you were given sedatives to kind of literally like be forced to take a load off. Both were regularly abused, but yeah, the thing pilots would be on a mission is amphetamines. And as we know, or I'm speaking from personal experience. I'm not a doctor, but stimulants can cause like aggression, euphoria, like psychosis in long-term use. Like it does kind of impair your judgment in a way, and like people hardly understand that now. They definitely didn't understand that in the 40s. So yeah, that is true. I can't really prove to what extent, but it still happens today. So
yeah. It's just so funny. It just makes me think, it's still so much encouraged and used, and now it's a prescription. But heaven forbid someone has a beer in theater, right? In the army, we weren't allowed to drink when we were in combat. Right?
Nope.
So no alcohol, but here's some Adderall for you. That sounds great.
Oh, you weren't allowed to drink when?
in theater in Afghanistan.
And anywhere in the Middle East.
Oh, I was like, in the movie theater? Like,
no.
Can you just like drink on base and somebody just spilled too much? Like, okay, thank you. I'm not hip to a lot of this lingo.
Right. And then it's just funny how that lingo plays such a role, right? And actually that does lead into the next question. I wanted to make sure we asked this one because I thought it was super interesting, and it's another one of Passan's, but how did, and I know I'm piecemealing some of your questions a little bit,
you're good,
Passan,
you're good.
but how did educators in Japan talk about the bombing's aftermath? How is it presented in the Japanese education system to young students today?
Okay.
I know I jumped ahead a little bit.
Oh no, that's all right.
Like,
let me
timing wise, I didn't. Because we'll hearken to the question too a little bit, I think, in your answer to this one.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenal question.
How is this presented? Yeah. So one thing I want to point out that is distinct with Japan's like experience in World War II is that they don't have like a state, like a line, like a agreed upon narrative in the way that America does, largely in the way that especially Germany does, right? Because they got out ahead of it, and you're taught a really explicit, like strict curriculum and like story of the war, and it doesn't really stray much from it, at least in like education. That doesn't really exist in Japan so much. Like the memory of the war itself is like constantly being negotiated. And I can't really speak a ton to like how it works in education. I'm not even really sure how Japan's education system this I like ran out of time when I was researching, obviously, but like I don't know if this would be interesting if they like have it where you can go by prefecture. They have more flexible, like how with states here, like one state can do one thing, another can be Common Core.
Right.
I don't know, but I will say that even though they I was impressed with like the takeaway that I got from visiting schools and museums, that they were very upfront about a lot of crimes that Imperial Japan committed. I think they do try to drive that home, but they face kind of the same problem that we do, where if you kind of talk about the victims of Imperial Japan, or you talk about the victims of the atomic bombings, because the Japanese government has done very little to accommodate them, it kind of delegitimizes like the growing right-wing like nationalist sentiment that exists in Japan, if that makes sense, right? Maybe this will help understand. When I attended like the peace ceremony at Hiroshima, Abe made a speech, Shinzo Abe, who was the prime minister until last year. And in the speech where he was supposed to be commemorating like a very solemn, sacred day, he was like calling for the rearmament of Japan. So you do see like this narrative being repackaged for like nationalistic purposes, but that happens everywhere. But in places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki specifically, there is like a whole like community culture around learning about the bombings, educating others, maintaining the peace parks, and volunteering, and taking care of others, reaching out, doing international like peace building stuff, like what I went on. So I'm sorry, that doesn't really answer your question
No,
specifically.
I think it's still good to understand that they are conflicted about it.
Yeah.
There is,
Yeah.
some discrepancy. But one of the things I like that you said was that Japan tends to be more upfront with the truth about their history, which I think
Yeah.
in the
On
United
certain
States
things.
we don't do. That's when we talk about things like racial healing and things like that, where we're not owning up to a lot of this. Like there's a big debate, of course, of critical race theory in the United States now, but critical race theory is just this acknowledgement of our own racist actions against a population of Americans that were here, and then in the South they're trying to ban that, of course, and so this lack of acknowledgement, I think, will not lead us to a moral healing of that. Like when we talk about that moral injury, again, a lot of Americans are complicit in these types of things as well, and even if they don't even realize it, and if we're not going to grow from those things if we don't acknowledge what we've done.
And like the example I talked about with like Jimmy Carter and Obama visiting, like there might be some acknowledgement, like, oh, Japan has finally started to acknowledge Korean victims of the atomic bombings and what they did to Korea, Manchuria, like, and China, like overall, they've started to acknowledge that. But at the same time, like on an institutional level, they are fighting tooth and nail, like not to recognize comfort women, not to pay them reparations or their family reparations. So there's like this disconnect. But it's like almost, what do you believe? Like if you say that, oh, we feel bad about this, we fucked up, but then you're fighting them in court, not against their like basic human rights, then what are you led to believe? And honestly, the same thing happened in the United States with the victims of Japanese internment. They never really got proper reparations, and the army engaged in a massive cover-up, literally destroying the evidence, or the evidence that they used that was faulty, extremely racist, literally just made up, fabricated, to justify putting 110,000 people in concentration camps. But you see in like in places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki that they're kind of like global ambassadors in the anti-nuclear movement, and they have, so on their own, but I can't like speak for Japan overall. I guess I would say the students that I met with and talked to, like a couple dozen kids, were like, yeah, we kind of went with a more like tragic narrative, which is to say, like, we admitted some fault, but it was like, oh, they weren't quite going all the way there.
Right.
But they mostly learned that, like, oh, this is just a lamentable thing that we did, without really learning the details, which is kind of how most Americans, I think, would feel about the atomic bombings.
Yeah. Or even our entire atomic and I guess nuclear campaign up through the 60s and 70s, nuclear development.
Yeah.
The number of random Pacific islands we've decimated.
Yeah. Bikini Atoll. Wiped it off the map, basically.
Yeah, because I think about, I can't remember the exact numbers, but what, 200,000 people died as a result of Hiroshima, and I think it's a little bit less than Nagasaki.
So 210,000 is the total combined, thereabouts, and that's a more liberal estimate. About 110,000 people died at Hiroshima, and about 70,000 were killed at Nagasaki. Oh, and I just want to point out before I forget that just another like proof that the bombs were not, that they were not military targets. I think only 3,000 Japanese troops were killed in Hiroshima, and about 300 were killed in Nagasaki.
Wow.
Out of 70,000 people. I think there were more American POWs killed in Nagasaki than actual troops, or the number was very close. And about a dozen or two American POWs were killed in Hiroshima, and then the rest were civilians. because these were not, like I said before, Japan ran out of military targets like months before this happened. Hiroshima had a munitions factory on the outskirts of town that wasn't targeted. The hypocenter of Hiroshima was a hospital. And 30 to, and for anyone who's inclined to say, well, oh, you know, they were all fascists, so who cares if they died? 30 to 40,000 of the bomb victims were enslaved Chinese and Korean people. So if you're trying to say that they're justified to advocate for them, they were liquidated in numbers that would rival anything the Japanese did too.
Right.
You know, it's not epically owning the fascists in any way. Like, this is, as much as we like to joke online and it breaks our brains and discourse breaks our brains, like, the reality is always more complicated. And like, this is where, you know, sorry, it just really frustrates me when people think that it's like this, like, it's like Dresden. Like, was Dresden justified? Like, no. And we never would have even considered dropping an atomic bomb on fellow white, you know, God-loving Christians. Except we dropped it on God-loving Christians at Nagasaki. Nagasaki was the largest Christian stronghold in Southeast Asia. So there was no, we had no qualms about dropping on other Christians. As maybe other white people
They just weren't white
I don't
Christians.
know.
Right.
Yeah.
Nagasaki went back to being one of the first open port in Japan.
Yes.
To welcome foreign traders.
Yeah. During their isolation period, it was like the only port that was open for like hundreds of years. So it was a big international cultural center, and Kyoto was actually one of the original proposed targets, but we decided against it because we said, oh, that's too far. It's a cultural, you know, it was the historic capital. Tokyo had only recently become it, I think, in like the 1860s. Anyways, but yeah, we were like, that too far, but we'll liquidate Nagasaki, which had just as much, if not more, like cultural importance, especially to us as Americans.
Do we have time for another question from the audience?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay. So for Outreach asks, well, talks about going to high school with Oppenheimer's great grandkid. They still make weapons, but they're still a nice enough person, so good for them. Hope they stop making weapons.
Oh, really?
What kind of reparations or actions would you want America to make, if any? I know that's a very loaded question.
We could start by just admitting it was wrong.
Can I be honest with you? I don't think I've ever even considered that, because I never even thought we'd get remotely close to there. I'm very much in the present and the here and now, which is that you have to fight tooth and nail just to get this story out. But like, what would reparations look? First of all, we haven't even given reparations to actual Americans who were in the internment camps. Like, hardly paltry reparations. But this is something I also wanted to like drive home, was that this causes generational trauma and generational loss. Even in the case of like Japanese Americans in internment camps, when they were forcibly evicted from their homes and all of their belongings were stolen and sold, their neighbors went and bought up their houses or stole their houses. Successful businesses like stores and things like that were stolen from them and never restored. So you're talking about people who fought tooth and nail just to like make it in this country, people who built this country, especially on the West Coast, who lost everything and are still kind of struggling with that generational like loss of like wealth, actual family, loss of history and culture. So we haven't even addressed that here. I really don't. I'm not gonna like pull something out of my ass. I don't know like mathematically what addressing that reparations wise would even mean. I think the most important thing that needs to happen right now is that we offer some sort of genuine apology and something even remotely approaching an honest assessment of what went down that day. But like I said, the reason why we avoid that is because the legitimacy of the United States drops significantly, and all of the actions that we took in Vietnam and Korea, in the Middle East, like fall completely unravels if the atomic bombings are called into question, which is why we've just kind of been in a stalemate for 75 years now. That's a very good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. Thank you. But I think just acknowledging it on a institutional like a top tier level from the
Right.
people who it matters to hear from will do a lot to undo this damage.
Yeah, and I agree that that's definitely a very difficult question to try to field anytime reparations come up, because it's really hard to put a monetary value on something like that. But definitely, I agree with you. The being forthcoming and honest about the actions of that day are a great one, and to stop creating these generational traumas, because I mean, our track record on civilian to combatant deaths are continuing to this day with drone strikes.
Yep.
Right.
And we're
And
just
it's
creating
easy.
more and more.
It's easy to forget this was 75 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about, there are people, we keep mentioning generational effect, like that were first generation after those bombings are still alive. Like they're
Right.
still, it to
Yep.
them was life, that they lived it, like, or their parents lived it, or so it's easy to
Yeah.
forget those things that for us it seems so far away, but we're talking,
Yep.
it's really not.
And I think that brings us into the next part of this conversation to really talk about historical trauma. And I think what a lot of people don't necessarily understand about historical trauma is how, you know, I like to try and break it down for people in the sense that, like, you know, if your grandparents went through something traumatic, they carried that through their lives, but they also carried that trauma through parenting your parents. And then your parents experienced, you know, that like secondary trauma from how they were treated from their parents. And then guess what? That then perpetuates down to you, and you have to hold on to that trauma as well. And if you don't take care of it, if you don't address it, you continue to carry that trauma further and further and further down that line. And that's why historical trauma is really like just starting to get like a lot of focus, is because the mental health field has expanded so much, and we're starting to see how historical trauma really has played a role in perpetuating a lot of inequalities we experience. And I firmly believe that a lot of this historical trauma will never heal until there's like at least that acknowledgement that Haley was talking about. Like, you need to acknowledge that the harm actually occurred, right?
The wheel needs to be broken, and that's a bad quote considering where it comes from, but
And I think I think with this incident in particular, the nuclear bombs, it's like literally it's radiation changing the DNA of people and children. I don't know, is it still like is radiation still an issue to this day over there?
That's an excellent point. I actually like wrote that somewhere in my notes, that like, just like how radiation is invisible, like the historical generational trauma is also something that's invisible, that goes alongside this. But is radiation still an issue? No, not really. In places like Fukushima, yes, obviously, where it's still being contained. But that's actually a really interesting thing that I found in my research over the years, is that the exact numbers vary, but let's say if you were exposed to radiation versus not, you have a 5 times higher risk than the average person of contracting, I think it's, or developing like solid cancer, like, which is any cancer that's not leukemia, because I guess leukemia operates differently. But so and also it's not something that's generationally passed down, the risk of cancer at least. And a lot of studies have concluded that right, because a lot of hibakusha were worried about having children, or people didn't want to have children with them because they were afraid of either catching the whatever ill they were afflicted with, or putting that on another child, a human being. But that's really not, there's no like trend that they found studying this, that they're any more likely to have some, it's just with the one hibakusha generation. So the genetic defects have kind of been contained. Yeah. And so that's why talking about the psychology is so important, because that arguably like affects them more on the day to day. Yeah.
In the chat, one of our viewers for Outreach, he brought up the term genetic trauma, and we talk about that within the context often of historical trauma, because the growing field of epigenetics, so how genetics presents itself in response to environmental stimuli, is a growing field, and our understanding of epigenetics is growing. So one of the things that we're starting to understand is how stress affects how babies develop within the womb, and how that will eventually develop into how their phenotypes develop, right? So
I've heard of that, yeah.
if I have, let's say, like a genetic marker for obesity, right? How my parents experience stress and then raise me as a child will influence whether or not that gene manifests later in life.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of the idea of epigenetics, that you'll carry some of this. We all have different trauma type markers, right? Everybody experiences those to some extent, but how they manifest is directly related to how you're nurtured. So when we talk about that nature versus nurture, it's actually a both and, right? So it is not an either or, it's a both and, right? So you are both influenced by your genetics. We all have different markers for different things, but how we are nurtured within our environment influences whether or not those things manifest.
It's so funny because I was talking with my boyfriend the other day about like the boomer question, like why are boomers the way they are? Like what happened? And it kind of there's this one kind of theory or like psychological paper I read years ago about like World War II and and World War One, like the generations first coming home with like really heavy like PTSD, and how that kind of caused the boomer psychology where like, yeah, you're born into a world of extreme wealth and extreme abundance and privilege, but you have to understand your parents are people, a lot of people whose parents went off to one war or two wars and died or got blown up and got fucked up and came back and raised you not having any of those needs met. Like the military and the government will barely even try to meet people's needs now, but in the 40s it was even worse. And so you have to understand like not only the psychological but like genetic, like, and I'm glad you brought up epigenetics because I kind of knew about it, but I wouldn't have thought to bring it up, that like it not only like shapes the way like your brain plasticity, but it's like the way that you chemically are. It's insane. And then it gets reproduced in Gen Z, and then maybe maybe it'll continue to echo through to the millennial generation. But it's crazy just how little, and it's such a shame that there's like an invisible like barrier to addressing a lot of these things, because it is fascinating science, and I'm sure there could be a lot of healing achieved around this if we weren't so committed to denying and downplaying not only the trauma of like victims of imperialism, but the people who carry it out, like wittingly or unwittingly, enthusiastically or not.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing people don't really associate with the boomer generation or the baby boomers, is that their parents were the ones that grew up through the Great Depression. So they went from their parents having America's lowest to them getting to grow up in America's highest with this rapid rate of growth, and just what that does to your parents with repressed trauma, repressed poverty, or well, not repressed poverty, but growing up through poverty, and the repressed trauma that it leaves you with, to now everything's good, everything's great, America's on top of the world.
Yeah. When I see my clients, and
but at what cost?
Right. Yeah. The global south.
Well, when I see my clients all the time, there's lots of conflict with parents, and we talk about this all the time. And I talk about how, well, I try to keep in mind that people try their best with what resources they have, right? And that includes emotionally and intellectually, right? So if they are emotionally kind of stunted, in the sense that like they're not responding to other people's needs and they lack a lot of empathy, well, what made them that way, right? So again, they're talking about this historical thing, right? So like, your parents or the boomer generation of that like kind of like entitlement, they always called my generation entitled, but I often find it's the opposite. But in my personal experience, I don't have research, but in that sense, like of that entitlement that they have, and then where did they learn that from? It's not
actually
always
have
their fault. Like it's. Well, I don't want to place blame. Fault is hard. And if you talk about even philosophically, I know I'm going off on tangents.
Don't worry about
my
it.
brain's going in a billion different directions. There's the whole field of free will skepticism, right? So like nothing's really anybody's fault, kind of thing if you take it to that extreme. But because it's not about placing blame, it's about acknowledging harm. Right?
I always invoke free will skepticism when I forget to put a fresh roll of toilet paper on the thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
What were you gonna say, Poisson?
Oh no, I was just saying. We were talking about the mentality of boomers as a monolithic whole, right? And I was reminded of an anecdote about General Patton from World War II, right? And we might ask, where did boomers get these ideas from? And I'm reminded of there was, Patton liked to go to the front lines or whatever and, inspect the troops, as officers like to do. And he came across this one soldier who was just PTSD'd out, staring in the distance, unresponsive. And Patton, grabbed him by his collar and smacked the shit out of his face and was like, hey, stop being a little bitch. You're being lazy and you're morally weak. And so you think, I think that definitely, and that's like a high-ranking officer doing that. So right. I can only imagine what company grade and all that was doing. So I think that, that institutional thing might shape a lot of their worldview.
You're a means to an end. You're not, you exist for some higher purpose, and your suffering is righteous, or at least it's not important.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the kind of secondary part of that question I asked earlier of, so how did the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima kind of affect the collective psyche of Japanese society? What is that historical trauma that maybe Japanese society as a whole might be experiencing moving forward?
So I mentioned earlier, Pearl Harbor syndrome, Barbarossa syndrome. There's definitely that similar sort of mindset in Japan. You have to understand that this country was subject to the most thorough and deadly psychological warfare campaign, one of the 20th century, probably, at least the most concentrated. But there's no one consensus about the bomb, there's no one feeling about the bomb, but it does weigh heavily on everyone there. And it's so let me just bring in a little bit of historical background. There, obviously, that we presided over Japan for a number of years after the war. Until 1952, we instituted a new constitution for them. We disarmed or demilitarized them, and really just kind of installed a constitution that was favorable to the United States. Yeah. We put a lot of higher ups in the imperial government back in charge, and or we shipped them off to Korea to go kill communists. But that's beside the point. We created something under this project called the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which went from 1946 to 1975. And this was not a means for treatment, but it was an extended scientific study and forcible or coerced human experimentation. This was not a humanitarian thing, but it was for military purposes, right? Because we're in the lead up to Korea, the U.S. was exploring the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and we wanted to see literally if it was viable for troops to be able to bomb a city, move in, occupy it, and then move out with having troops die in mass. And so if you know about Leslie Groves and kind of how the mad scientific we wanted human targets to experiment on with the atomic bombings, then this is kind of a continuation of that, what the ABCC did. So my friend that I brought up earlier, Coco, who was, I believe, 5 years old when the bombs dropped, younger than that, she was forced to undergo ABCC testing for a decade, in which and I say forced, I believe in her case, they would offer incentives, because people had to call out of work, to go and be evaluated and get what they thought was, medical treatment, but it wasn't. But people had to be there the whole day and couldn't work. And you also have to think about, like, when you're from Hiroshima and your house and your entire neighborhood and your entire city is destroyed, you don't have much. So they offered food, they offered money here and there and resources to kind of like coerce people into participating in human experimentation. So Coco was offered, you know, money, groceries, whatever, just like paltry stuff, in exchange to undergo testing in which she had to strip naked and stand alone on a stage under a spotlight in front of strange men, all while she was going through puberty. And we kind of bonded over like the really fucked up like sexism that was happening, kind of like on the feminist element of that. But this happened to thousands and thousands of people. I believe the Japanese government officially recognized about 700,000 hibakusha, so victims of the atomic bombing. So 210,000 people about died as a direct result, and then more survived and kind of died later. Um, of Are there natural causes when you're afflicted with radiation poisoning? I don't know, but so yeah, we occupied Japan till 1952. We implemented a new constitution, and we kind of low key maintained like imperial society in a lot of ways. We said that we would not accept Japanese surrender with the maintenance of the emperor, and then we kept him in anyways. Right, that was the entire crux of our decision to drop the bomb, was that we wanted the emperor out, kept him anyways, kept all these people in power. Shinzo Abe's grandfather was called the monster of Manchuria for how many people he killed there. And then he became prime minister of Japan in like 58 or 60, I want to say. And he was directly installed by the US government. But you kind of see here how the U.S. has turned into a puppet state, or excuse me, Japan has turned into a puppet state of the U.S. in a lot of ways. But let me back it up to, when you think of the atomic bomb, I mean, what's on my shirt, right? Well, there's the building, but then there's the mushroom cloud in the background. That's the image of the bombings that most Americans have. That might be because you played Fallout, or because you watched a movie, you watched Doctor Strangelove, whatever. But that is a very deliberate, like, top-down image that is removed from all of the carnage on the ground, and that's very deliberate, and that's kind of like an ironically like symbolic uh, thing that, like, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but like it's representative of like the entire American like school of thought, or like view of them, I should say.
Do you
Oh,
think,
go ahead.
I'm just kind of curious, do you think that's because it's separating the human aspect of the bomb itself, right?
Yeah,
like, so
absolutely.
It's easier to see the mushroom cloud than it is the building that was destroyed that might have had hundreds of people inside of it.
Yeah, and it's easier to think about the awe of the size of it than the horror of who it affects.
It's the view from the plane at 70,000 feet. It's not hundreds of people boiling alive in a river because it's 200 degrees in the air and they are dying of thirst. You know, like, it's some of the pictures that I could show you, like, but so like we have the mushroom cloud. Japan has like the notion of like the pikadon. That's what they call the bombs, and the pika means flash, like Pikachu, electric, and don means explosion. And that's, you know, what most survivors will tell you, is that because they didn't realize that it was like a different weapon, they thought it was just more bombing. But there's blinding flash of light, and then the boom, and then the fire comes. I think it was a British team of scientists who said the people who were killed by the atomic bombings were actually killed 3 times. Once by the flash, the second by the explosion, and then by burning. But those close to the hypocenter were turned to charcoal. Some families could only identify the dead by their gold teeth. But so yeah, the atomic bombings inflicted mass psychological trauma on not only the people who were there, but everybody in that country, and it continues to resonate through generations. And it's gone unaddressed, and it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You can only deny this for so long. It just gets more and more kind of like aggressive, I guess. But there's a psychologist named Robert Lifton who said that the continuous and unresolvable encounter with death is a unique feature of the atomic bomb disaster. These are people who witness power that has only been seen in the Bible, and they had to continue on living with everything about their life stripped from them or literally incinerated, with no pathway for help, no outlet. The U.S. government experimenting on them in exchange for groceries, and furthermore, he saw that Hibakusha experienced a large scale loss of faith in the structure of existence, is his words. And I mentioned this before, where I said it was kind of like a mental resignation from the social contract, after having witnessed a specifically man-made Armageddon. So it begs a lot of existential questions about death, and we cannot know death until we die. But the Hibakusha are arguably the closest anyone has ever come to knowing death, and the ways that they've been systemically and socially maligned. I don't know if I'm saying that word right, but marginalized. Just compounds that. Lifton also coined the term nuclear numbing to describe the opposite kind of avoidant and apathetic response of the American public to the atomic bombings. We're all somewhat aware of what happened, but we all engage in this systemic cultural denial. And like Justin brought up earlier with the radiation, the psychological effects are invisible and they carry on, or the radiation itself doesn't carry on through generations. The psychological one does, which is why I argue it's more important to talk about. But the debate over whether the trauma is related to radiation or compounded by radiation, we'll never really know. But I feel like it's more of a social issue. Like I mentioned, the increased cancer risk is relatively low. So a majority of Hibakusha struggle with immense grief and survivor's guilt and PTSD. There is this man named Steven Okazaki who made a documentary called White Light, Black Rain. And he said, I realize that surviving is not just about physically surviving. It's more about spiritually surviving. I've met people who were not physically hurt by the bomb, but who were really destroyed by what they went through. One of the survivors in the film had to take breaks every couple hours so she could rest and take her morphine. And contrast that with the Army veterans or the military veterans who were involved in the bombings and may show remorse and kind of buy into this tragic narrative, but they operate with a certain amount of distance. One pilot said in that same film, our endeavor in using these bombs was to win the war. End the war as soon as possible and win the war. No sympathy, no regrets. And another pilot stated, it had worked as designed, it had done what war does. It destroys people. And so that denial is kind of very deep rooted, and it's indicative of a deeper kind of psychological turmoil bubbling under the surface, I feel.
Absolutely.
And then you see a lot of you maybe have seen films like Barefoot Gen, Grave of the Fireflies. Kurosawa made a film called I Live in Fear about the atomic bombings, and you see, I don't know, I'm not well versed enough in film history to kind of tie the atomic bombings to the rise in anime and experimental Japanese art styles, and but I feel it does play a part in explaining why a lot of art that you see coming out of Japan in the decades following is so absurd and unlike anything else in the world, because a lot of the people making it witnessed something that kind of just broke their entire perception of reality. The guy who made Barefoot Gen, his name is Keiji Nakazawa. He was 6 years old. He lost his father, sister, and younger brother when their home collapsed and burned in the wake of the bombing. His sister was killed immediately, but he and his mother had to endure the screams of his 4-year-old brother as he burned to death inside his house. And that was the basis for Barefoot Gen. I could tell more stories. I have a couple, or we could.
I'm sure they all sound. They keep getting worse and worse, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think the analogy of the mushroom cloud and then the Pika Dong, did I say that right?
Mhm.
Is indicative of how the two groups kind of perceive the events itself, right? The mushroom cloud, Americans see it from above. They're very disconnected. Like all they see is just kind of like this cloud of smoke, while from the Japanese perspective, you're seeing that flash boom and then destruction, right? So like just being able to have that like illustration of those different experiences so kind of um, nicely summed up in that way. It's just eye-opening how
Yeah.
this group as Americans, we try to disconnect ourselves to escape that moral conundrum, that moral obligation of like what we had done, while the Japanese continue to live with that trauma of
Yep.
what had been done to them, but
Yeah.
also have to struggle with this idea of like, did we do it to ourselves by going to war and being fascists and things like that? I can't
Mhm.
Yeah,
imagine the psychological tussle that they must be going through to
Mhm.
try and like reconcile that in their brain.
I must imagine it's kind of hard to not feel that, or to overcome that feeling of, did we do this to ourselves, when the people who dropped the bombs on you takes control of your government
Right.
for almost a decade, and then reinstalls everyone who led you up to that point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's the most fucked up kind of Stockholm syndrome. And it,
Yeah.
kind of partly explains why Japan is in the throes of like a far right nationalist uprising. I mean, Abe himself was like involved with Nippon Kaigi, which excuse my pronunciation, but that's like the largest kind of ultra nationalist lobby. Like I mentioned, like his grandfather was literally like esteemed war criminal that was far right ultra nationalist, and that like there's a sizable amount of people in Japan that do want to restore that, and it's kind of because of the way the end of the war played out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, when you build, when you commit a really honestly like fascist, like imperialist act of unnecessary like act of aggression against another country, and then install the people who like kind of brought that on in power, and then all in tandem with the people who did that to you, naturally you're going to create a society that's sympathetic to fascism. I mean,
Right.
come on, we see that everywhere, that like the West took over in World War II instead of the Soviet Union, and that's like, we're bordering on counter historical territory there, but that's also why the end game of World War II matters, especially if you care about epically owning the fascists, because what happened with the power grab that America did by bombing these places is that they were able to gain more territory, like diplomatically and literally, and foster more places in the world that were sympathetic to fascism
And
and
even with, I can
Soviet
comment on
states.
Poland nowadays too, because Poland was part of the what do they call it, the
Soviet
Warsaw Pact, right?
Oh.
So
Yeah.
they were under Soviet influence, but then the Soviet Union collapses, their standard of living drops, and then it's like you were saying, that same resentment builds up, and now they have the far right. I think they call it the PIS, Law and Justice Party over there.
Yeah.
It's the same story,
Yeah.
And it's just amazing when I think about the psychology of like a lot of far right movements. A majority of them are just based on fear, just an overwhelming fear of either the past or the slippery slope concepts they have about the future, or just fear of the other. And I really think that it is often perpetuated by a trauma. I think
Also,
about
spoiler alert: a lot of those countries are militarily backed and trained by the United States
right.
today.
Yeah.
Today, as we speak.
Yeah.
I even think about, even in the United States, the trauma of Vietnam, and how they tried to like still paint that as a just intervention.
Yeah.
That
Even with
trauma creates fear.
that ad that we had where the military did those cartoon recruitment ads, and
Oh my
it was about a
goodness.
woman who wanted to join the service, but she talked to her dad, and her dad said not to join because he'd gone to Vietnam for civil unrest.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the grossest understatement of a war.
Right.
Yeah. Vietnam is another thing where like symbolism plays in heavily into like this construction of historical memory. Because when you think about like the Vietnam Memorial, it's very solemn. It's literally sunken into the ground as if we'd rather forget it. And all it is the name of the 56,000 people Americans who were killed there. But if the Vietnam War Memorial included the names of all the people who were killed in the Vietnam War, including the 3 million Cambodians and Laotians and 4 million Vietnamese, that memorial would be 4 miles long. But it's really, we kind of would rather forget Vietnam because it was the first time we really got our asses handed to it. I mean, Korea, you could say was a draw or a stalemate or whatever.
The funny thing about Vietnam too is if you look at the history of it, Ho Chi Minh, before World War II and all that, looked up to America. He thought it was like an inspirational example, and he's a Vietnamese nationalist. He wasn't a communist, so we definitely messed that one up.
He was a busboy at some hotel in Boston, and then a couple years later, Malcolm X worked in the same kitchen.
Oh, wow.
That's like a fun fact. But
and I think you bring up a really valid point, Haley, in that like I'd rather it be 3 miles long, because if we're not including all the victims of a conflict, then we're not really reconciling the conflict itself. Yeah. Right? We're going to perpetuate the trauma of that conflict if we're only recognizing who we want to recognize as the heroes or the real victims, right? Because I think they a lot of the people in the United States, at least now, have this maybe perception of the Vietnam War and the draftees be kind of just being a victim of bad politics or something like that. But again, you forget about the 3 million plus people that died in Vietnam that were not Americans, and who we need to acknowledge too. Otherwise, we're not going to really heal from that trauma, and that's why. I know I'm probably selling Veterans for Peace a little bit, but that's why Veterans for Peace is so important, because we want to acknowledge everybody who is affected by this war, whether or not they were an enemy combatant, a civilian, or an American. It doesn't matter. They're all victims of, honestly, war is more often
capitalism.
The poor are the victims of war because wars are fought amongst the rich with the poor as pawns.
Yeah, war is a racket, right?
Right, exactly. War is a racket. I just think about when I was in Afghanistan, and all I could think about half the time was like, well, if my camp wasn't here, that rocket couldn't hit me. Right? So and when 9/11 happened, I was in 7th grade. So, to think that we went to a place to just occupy a space, my mission was literally just be there, so like that enemy combatant, I am in his space, I am in his land, and he couldn't combat me if I just wasn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I ended up, that's part of what drove me down the path of anti-war, is because when I was in Iraq, there was a couple of nights where we got mortared real bad, like they were landing right outside or we were sleeping and everything. And then I was like, I got some PTSD symptoms from that. Like I couldn't sleep for like 3 or 4 days straight. But then I thought, as I reflected on it more, I was like, man, if just a couple of nights that in the grand scheme of things are rather mild, like if it messed with my head that much, I can only imagine how like the head of an Iraqi child or an Afghan child or any of the other countries that we're in, right? Like how do they feel when they're getting it, 10 times worse every single day?
And I think about, in both Afghanistan and Iraq, how we did the exact same thing we did in Japan. We installed a constitutional government that favored the United States, that was made up of a lot of like already powerful people in those countries that were already disliked, and of course that that only fuels or bolsters the resistance because it's seen as a puppet government, which it frankly
in the case of Afghanistan, it literally came to bite us in the ass like 20 years later.
Right. So
you're all speaking to like an actual dilemma that historians kind of face with like the construction of history, like the promotion of one narrative or like the memorialization of one group of people or one event necessitates silence on another or the downplaying of another. Like the landscape of the public memory, like around the bombings, it oscillates between like commemoration and silence, like triumphant and tragic narratives. Like, but history, you can kind of define it as like the creation of silences. Like the act of commemorating something might be, you know, a war you fought in, you might have the right to speak, but then nobody else does. Some people feel compelled to silence themselves, but I think the story of the atomic bombings is in a lot of way like a story of silence and censorship, whether that be voluntary or involuntary, individual or on a state level, on an institutional level. But what that does in practice is it contributes to like this muddled narrative of this event, like this kind of confused like state of flux that we've just been in for 75 years, knowing that we did something wrong but not having the tools or like the go ahead to really like question it, because you know if the government isn't going to address it, then you know that's where the conversation ends for most people, and
Yeah.
why would it not?
Right.
Yeah, and if the corporations that have power in government and in media don't want to bring it up, it's on the onus of a person to research it themselves. I do have a really good last question whenever we get to that point, but I don't want to jump the conversation that far.
Well, I think we should probably start wrapping up. We're approaching like 2 hours. I don't even think we're gonna get to Smite at all.
That's
which is great. This conversation has been absolutely amazing and wonderful, and thank you so much for being here. I think we'll let Haas's question kind of sum up everything and be the last question of the night, unless the chat has a few that they want to ask. But
Thank you
go
so
ahead,
much.
Haas.
Having a kick-ass time.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're enjoying it here. Yeah, it's been awesome having you on. I was really interested in how you said that you studied under another historian and came about that way of life. I was wondering, how would someone in a similar position who say is really interested in a period of history go about seeking a mentor like that, or going and following in your footsteps?
Great question. I mean, for me, it was just like I had the kind of gifted, I don't even know if you could call it gifted kid thing, but I always tried to befriend my professors, or, you know, like on a case by case basis. I think that people who are genuinely curious about history or whatever you're curious about and really want to make a positive change in the world, they gravitate towards one another. But make yourself a resource for whoever you're trying to, you know, establish a relationship with. Just talk to them. Don't put yourself out there. Don't be shy. My mentor kind of like gravitated towards me because I was always active and engaged, asking questions. Then he kind of offered that I would, you know, tell me about events or other stuff that he was doing, and I kind of got roped into that circle. And then I did research for him, and then I did more research. Then we went to Russia. Then we went to Japan. Then he put my research in his book, and then it's like so it's really kind of there's no like formula to like making those kinds of connections, but always put yourself out there. I mean, I wish I could say that I got paid for half the research that I did, but I got paid in experience and expertise, and you know, that's just how academia is. It's kind of evil, but just if you have an inkling of like, hey, I think this guy's really cool, or I like his research, just talk to him. Academics fucking love to talk about the nerdy shit that like 99% of people like don't care about. So you are probably like a godsend to them, just like a young, earnest, like scrappy person that wants to like continue this crusade, because that's what a lot of history is. It's like a crusade. So put yourself out there, make connections. If not with the person you want to, then somebody they work with, or their TA or their research assistant. Like it's, you got to navigate the labyrinth a little bit, play the game a little bit, but it's worth it. And more often than not, you come out with like not only colleagues but friends. So best of luck to you if you're. I just got extremely fucking lucky.
Yeah.
I actually have a similar along those same lines. So I googled your professor just to get a little bit of information, and they teach at the American University. So does David Vine. Do you know David Vine?
Yeah, David Vine is my other mentor. I literally have his book like right behind me.
I finished his book like 2 months ago.
Which
Oh.
one?
Base
Base
Nation.
Nation.
It
Yeah,
was-
that book's a fucking banger. David was
Oh my god.
he was my anthro mentor, and then I switched to history, and then Peter was my that's so funny. I love David.
Uh-huh.
He does a lot of great accessible scholarship on imperialism and
Mhm.
he US imperialism specifically, and he tries to make as much of that as open source as possible. So if you like are kind of new to this school of thought, David Vine is a great resource. He's done a bunch of podcasts, there's videos and stuff. He just dropped a book called United States of War, just kind of a continuation. It's more about like the political economy and like the military industrial complex as opposed to like the physical like institution of the bases. But that's so funny you bring that up. Yeah, David's awesome. He's like an actual sweetheart. Peter's like kind of weird and old and nerdy, and like he's a sweet guy too. But David is like legitimately the nicest person I've ever met, and he fucking loves to hear from like students and like fans or whatever. So you can
that's
just
awesome.
connect with him. Doesn't matter who you are.
Right? I just might send him a
That's so
fan letter
funny.
because his
Yeah, you definitely
book
should.
was just like life changing. Honestly, like I just didn't know. Like I was now involved in the anti-war movement, but I just didn't know how messed up like all the bases that we have. I like to tell people that like people who fear like the China threat, and I'm putting that in quotations because that's just the narrative that people, the military industrial complex, is trying to sell. You think about how many bases the United States has. Total, it's over 800, and you think about how many military bases China has outside of China. It's one, and it's in North Africa. So who's threatening who, right?
Yeah,
Right.
like
Yeah.
for some reason that North African base is like 10 times more of a big deal than like the
Yeah,
800
and
that
I
he
believe
has.
it's a
That's another
logistics base, so it's
conversation.
like they're literally just carting supplies around.
Well, the U.S. has AFRICOM, so
Right.
like
Oh, yeah.
maybe,
We
and
have-
I think Russia has like a dozen bases abroad or whatever. Like
it's not even that many.
big whoop, yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. So it's just
But
yeah.
that's so funny that you bring up David, because like Peter's whole like the bomb stuff was like the kind of moral existential facet of like U.S. imperialism, and David's research was like the logistical, like kind of institutional, like this is how this works. These are how many bases we have and where, and if you understand how something works, like on a policy level, you understand how it can be dismantled. So it's really, you really don't want to have one thing without the other.
Yeah, I loved his story in his book. He talked about there's a base in Italy, northern Italy, that like the Pentagon pushed to be built, and then they ended up
Vincenzo?
didn't even using it. Like
Yeah.
they barely even use it, and they wanted it to be. It was supposed to be a base that was supposed to be a better staging point for troops in Germany and troops in Italy, and then they ended up not even using the base for what their intended purpose was,
Yeah.
and it doesn't even occupy the intended unit that was supposed to occupy it, and it doesn't even have the troops that its capacity can fill.
They're just fulfilling the contracts. Like that
Right.
was really a Joker-fying moment to me, was understanding how many U.S. military bases are just glorified Dave and Buster's. Literally, some of them
Oh,
even
man.
have bowling alleys and like
Yeah.
shit like that. Actually, a
I
lot
may
of
or
them
may
do.
not have installed Russian Skyrim on all of the USO computers.
Hell yeah,
Allegedly.
allegedly.
Yeah.
Right.
There was
There are
another
federal agents outside my house. Sorry.
there was one more question from chat. If you feel up for going back a little
Yeah.
bit and answering it, Hayden.
Yeah, lest I start riffing too much.
Fair enough. No, we enjoy the riffing. That's half of what we do. How much was the impact of the invasion by the Soviet Union a factor in Japanese surrender attempts versus just before the atomic bombings? I know we kind of covered this a little
Oh.
bit, and I know that's a really big question.
It is a big, beefy question, but I'll try to give you the rundown. So, when I've talked about the fire bombings, you understand how brutal those were, how constant, how like all-encompassing the fire bombings were. And as a result, they kind of backfired in achieving their purpose of demoralizing the Japanese, because when we started to threaten the use of a new weapon, a bigger weapon, a more powerful weapon, everybody in the Imperial like War Council was like, it didn't register because they're like, well, how can it get any worse than what we're going through? Like, all of our major cities are destroyed. Like, they were really kind of indifferent to additional carnage in that regard. Like, oh, we're gonna get bombed some more. And also on the US like side, a lot of people did regard nuclear weapons as just like no different than any other conventional weapon. Like, it was no different than napalm or no different than cluster bombs and this, that, and the other thing. So that was a large. So when you look back at like memos and logs of the like Imperial War Council's like deliberations in the lead up to the bombings, they were aware to a certain extent, even before Truman sent an official warning, but it factored into the conversation even after the bombings, almost not at all. The crux of their and this is something you have to understand about the history of Japan too, is that before Japan went fascist, there were a lot of different elements at play in early modern Japanese history. There were anarchist contingents, there were socialist contingents, and it was a huge power struggle getting Japan to the point where it was. And throughout the history of the war, there were coups, there were assassination attempts on a lot of high-ranking people. So Japan was in a state of turmoil, which helps you understand that why their biggest concern was always a Soviet invasion and takeover. They did not want to be communist. And they saw the Red Army, against all odds, beat back the Nazis, the largest invading force in human history. They beat them handily. They knew how many people and like the might of the Red Army's war machine, and they knew that uh, upon like because they fucking steamrolled Manchuria. The invasion of Manchuria began on like midnight at August 8th, or so the morning of August 9th, a couple hours before the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And within that amount of time, I think like 30,000 people were killed like in the first day alone or something like that. And I think I'm forgetting who said this specifically. It might have been I think it was actually Curtis LeMay who said that if the Soviet invasion had been allowed to continue, they would have reached Hokkaido within 2 weeks, like ahead of schedule. That's how quickly they were just toppling, because Japan was not equipped to fight a war on one front at that point, let alone two. And and you have to understand that the American invasion was not slated to begin until November. Um, Operation Downfall was not supposed to begin until November 1st, by which point they would have almost certainly folded to the Soviets, especially since the Soviets were offering them the retention of the emperor, and they literally couldn't hold out any longer. Japan was also on the verge of a coup right around the time that all of this happened, but it was always the Soviet invasion that was the major factor, I think. And the timing of America dropping the bomb was very deliberate, because we wanted to, we agreed, Stalin agreed to open up the Eastern Front at Yalta in May of 1945. So we knew that they were going to come in, and we knew what they had achieved in Europe and what spoils they were entitled to, right? But so the timing there, not only was it strategically unnecessary, but it was, again, like a diplomatic play to cheat the Soviets out of like their spoils, which a lot of them were in Manchuria and railways in Mongolia, potentially some of the Japanese mainland. So yeah, I hope that helps start to answer your question a little bit, but I could talk about that question alone for literally 2 hours. And
Yeah,
I
I think you
think
covered it really well.
I think I linked, or somebody in the chat could link a podcast that I did kind of going over more details about this, or
Yeah,
I'd be happy to direct you guys to some resources about that question. I wish I could do it more justice, but I want to let you poor boys go to sleep.
You're fine. I'm a night owl.
Yeah.
Right, same.
I'm off tomorrow.
Thank you, Haas, for linking some of those episodes in the chat.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
want to
got you.
also give you a chance before we start kind of wrapping up too, to also like have any plugs. So like how do people, if they wanted to get plugged in, not only to maybe some of your research and books and authors and things like that, but also into helping, like what could could people do to help the peace movement?
Right. So, there are not since the 80s has there been like a real robust like anti-nuclear movement in the United States, but Veterans for Peace, and
Mm-hmm.
that's like part of their line. They're like explicitly nuclear abolitionists.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have worked with you guys a lot in the past with like events and stuff.
Awesome.
Veterans for Peace is a great place to start. There's if you a lot of like environmental groups like the Sunrise Movement, they have like nuclear stuff as a part of their platform.
Right.
um if you want to advocate or like get more resources about like actual hibakusha, like that movement in Japan, the largest organization is called Hidankyo. And then there's also like Mayors for Peace over in Hiroshima. That's like a coalition of like thousands of mayors from 150 countries across the globe that kind of are all committed to a world without nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of stuff happening in international law right now, like follow the UN, like the we just ratified like the official ban on nuclear weapons and testing.
Right.
So yeah, I wish I could say like, and there's a ton of smaller organizations. I think I made a thread about this that I'll try to boost when I get off here. But I think the best thing you can do really is to talk about this with your friends and family, because I think as we've shown, the narrative falls apart pretty quickly once you have the right facts and the right stories. And just being able to understand this on a human level, understand like the magnitude of the loss of life, it makes it so much easier to turn people, because what happened was inhuman and it should never happen again, and it puts us all at risk. So talk to people, educate yourselves is the best thing I could say.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of different organizations such as Veterans for Peace, and even if you're not a veteran, you can be a member of Veterans for Peace. There's also Peace Action is another good one that I'm aware of, and then
About Face, I know
About
that's a good
Face.
anti-war organization.
I'm also thinking, I'm more thinking very specifically nuclear, but I'm thinking World Beyond War.
World Beyond War is great.
They have a lot of good information as well, which is awesome. They're always like they put out a daily newsletter, which is, a wealth of knowledge a lot of the time, and they also have webinars and events that you can gain more information, which is just amazing to see. So I encourage you, just keep learning and reading, and anything by David Vine, I guess, is good, and anything by
Peter Kuznick.
Peter Kuznick.
Watch or read Untold History, because that's what really put me on this path, and it's just a great alternative view of all of 20th century history, so helps you put everything in context. But yeah, stay vigilant, because this shit is depressing. I burned myself out when I first learned about all this shit. Like, I would cry myself to sleep being like, oh man, like doomsday is gonna happen tomorrow and everybody I know is gonna die. Like, you gotta pace yourself, keep some distance from it so that you don't burn out and that you don't go crazy learning about this stuff, because
we got a support channel on our Discord, if you do need to vent about something.
That's great. Yeah, but please, like, do not go on this crusade alone and at the cost of your own mental health, because there are a ton of people involved in this, and we got to take care of each other. Like, that's just kind of what you need to take away from this is we counter this like very evil industrial complex by forging genuine human connections and strengthening them, and perhaps that's like not a scientific worldview, but it's what's kept me sane and kept me on this path. So just thanks for your time and consideration. It really means a lot to me.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This was just an amazing stream that was just full of so much that I did not know previously, and knowing the facts helps just solidify my morality, right? Like, sometimes I always, you question whether or not you feel like you're doing the right thing or you're advocating for the right thing, because maybe you just don't have all the facts. And it was just really nice to hear all the facts, get a lot of the good information that my soul was missing. I want to go around and allow everybody to maybe have a last few seconds, to kind of sum up some of your thoughts. and we can start with whoever might have some thoughts at the moment. Unfortunately, we weren't joined by Sin tonight. He was really busy, but I left an avenue open for him. But I know he's always got different stuff going on. He's probably one of the busiest people I know right now. So, especially with our if you don't know, just made me think of it. Our Veterans for Peace National Convention is actually this weekend. We have a bunch of great seminars, some on nuclear abolition, but we cover a variety of different topics. I personally will be on a panel on Sunday about anti-war efforts post 9/11. So that'll be an interesting panel, just to plug my own stuff. Oh, thank you for the gifted subs.
Heyo.
Awesome. Hey.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Cash money.
Thanks for outreach.
Right?
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, what happened to my? Okay, there we go. No, I guess I'll go first. And I was just thinking, like, we're talking about, like, I know earlier at the beginning we were talking about how racism and that sort of thing was used as a dehumanization tool to make it easier for the public to swallow nuclear weapons use. And I would say just be cautious with that, especially with China and Russia, because there is a lot of xenophobia and anti-Asian hatred.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of Russophobia. Just go listen to, like, what's her name? Rachel Maddow on MSNBC.
Yeah.
Half her show's complaining about Putin. But just those same patterns start developing. And, you know, we were talking about what can you do as an individual? Like, no one's Superman and can't do this all by themselves. But, like, I guess, for example, if you hear, like, anti-Chinese or anti-Russian racist comments, like, you know, shut that down then on the spot. Like, because if that stuff goes unchecked, it can lead to, like, you know, nuclear war, all other kinds of horrible things. But that's
a
all I gotta
fantastic
say.
point. Thank you. I meant to bring that up, so thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any last minute thoughts, Haas or Krios?
Yeah. Don't be a pawn for the military-industrial complex. Do your own research. Look at everywhere.
Don't join.
Haley, it's been awesome having you on. You are an incredible font of knowledge, and it's been great listening to you talk.
Thank you
and
so
you
much.
and your boyfriend are absolutely welcome in the Discord. Welcome to hang out anytime you all want. And hope to game with you all sometime.
Oh yeah, I would love to just maybe talk about something a little more lighthearted and carry Justin through A Realm Reborn and shit. But you guys have been awesome. Definitely gonna stay in touch. Like, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think I've made a bunch of friends in this Zoom call tonight.
Well, awesome.
We're all
This
glad
is
to
really
be five,
tonight.
so.
Well, I heard you're a Final Fantasy 14 player. I know that's like starting to kick off in the Discord a little bit. I'm super excited for that.
Yeah, come on over. It's a movement.
Excalibur, right? That was the server?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I admittedly haven't had too much time, but I might hop on tonight. I think I will hop on tonight.
I was actually thinking about hopping on after this. So.
Yeah, same.
Cool.
I'll see you then.
Yeah, we'll take that off air though.
Krios, anything you want to say?
No, yeah, and now we're gonna get to the games and go for another 3 hours.
Another 4,
right,
yeah.
guys.
Good.
No, I mean, you guys all kind of touched and summed it up really well. You know, Haley, thank you for joining us. It was wonderful. I learned a lot. Sorry, I didn't make a lot of responses or anything. It's not a topic that.
Don't worry about it.
I didn't study history beyond high school. Like I made it a point not to. I studied computers, you know. So, so to hear somebody who's such an expert in it, it was really good to get those point of views and everything. And then all of you guys actually brought up good points, including the people watching the stream with your questions. You know, I never thought about different points of view of the morality of it until we started talking about it for this week. I'm like, wow, that actually was a really terrible thing we did. Like, it's something that as an ally, I never thought about before. And then you guys mentioned the current wars that we've been going through with Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, nothing's changed. So it was very eye-opening. So like I said, sorry I didn't participate much as far as conversation wise, but I was just so struck by like the realizations of everything. So thank all of you guys, but like I said, the viewers, Haley, Phoenix, Basan, Haas, definitely was a big one for me.
Yeah, seriously, it was a privilege to have such like thoughtful hosts, and also the audience. Like, thank you for doing this with your Sunday night and being so thoughtful and engaged. It's awesome. Good students, literally. All.
I do want to say it is Monday.
Right.
Oh, it's Monday?
Yeah.
That's how you know you're an academic.
right?
is when you
Yeah,
lose
right.
track of the days.
I literally had to like hide my books just being strewn about and like shove them off my bed and cover them with blankets so I didn't look like I was like doing the like Charlie from Always Sunny like conspiracy stuff on the wall like with my research. Yeah.
Right.
I was like, nobody actually makes their bed. She only did this for. No, I'm just kidding.
I you might be
Mine
might
isn't
not be
made
wrong.
in the other room.
I did want to make sure I plugged because I went to the convention website and wanted to see if we were doing any specific workshops on anti-nuclear programming, and there is one titled "Is Nuclear War Unstoppable? What Veterans and Youth Can Do About It." And we have
Cool.
that panel will consist of Alan Ware, who is an international peace and disarmament campaigner, Helen Jackard, who is the project manager for the VFP Golden Rule, which is our peace boat, which will actually be making it up the East Coast next year, which is super exciting.
Awesome.
Ken Mayers, who's a VFP board of director, and Tristan, and I'm going to butcher this last name, Gayette, who's the campaign director for Beyond the Bomb. And I just linked that program in the Beyond the Bomb in the chat as well. So I encourage you all to check that out too. And so coming up the rest of the week, I think, and Haas is going to have to help me out with this one. I always like
Fair
butcher
enough.
the schedule, right? Tomorrow night is Rocket League. So Rocket League will be continuing and ending, I think, their discussion. They're almost done with it. Their Star Wars Bad Batch discussion. It has been absolutely awesome. A lot of good themes about militarism in that show. I highly encourage people to check it out. Then there is Wednesday. This week is D&D. And they'll be continuing their campaign. I don't remember what this one was called.
What edition do you guys play?
Broken Throne. I want to say it's 5e.
Okay.
But we're always willing to spin up more D&D games. This is just the streamed one.
Oh,
Right.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. By the way, on Kickstart, there's an Avatar tabletop RPG for Avatar fans. Just saying.
We're all a bunch of RPG fans, so we'd love
If anyone wants
tabletops.
to play
Yeah.
Magic, hit me up. I'm always down.
Right. Thursday this week is our community game night, right? Yes. Thursday this week is
bollocks.
community game night. Friday is, of
Almost
course,
as fun.
our military ad slam, hosted by Plantifa. That's always a lot of fun. And then, of course, next Monday will be our kind of back to our normal Mental Health Monday stream, where we're going to talk about next week. Last week we talked about, I introduced a lot of themes about PTSD. Next week we're going to talk about treatment options, right? So, like, what does treatment actually look like for PTSD? I know I mentioned a few during the stream last week, but I'll go more in depth on what those treatment actually looks like. Because there's a lot of hope for PTSD treatment, which I think people think that it is kind of like this hopeless, you're always going to have it and it's always going to be problematic. And I will say that you'll never be
always have it.
completely free of it,
Yeah.
but you will be able to manage your symptoms much better with a lot of the treatment options that are available.
It does,
right?
and don't worry, they're not like, I was afraid when I went, they're going to throw you in a straitjacket. Like, that.
Right.
No, it's not how it works. So
No.
I just wanted to say that.
Yep.
In case.
So yeah. So next week we'll talk more about that, and we'll probably be coming back to Smite. We didn't get to it this week, but we'll get to it next week, and still trying to support the ban on Blizzard until they kind of figure their stuff out. So we'll be continuing with Smite until further notice on that one, unless another MOBA kind of comes along that we start enjoying.
Honestly, though, as much as I loved HOTS, Smite is really awesome. I'm gonna
Right?
go for like a self-toot horn here for a second. Like I've only played like 5 games. They were all arena. I haven't done the jungle laning and all that stuff yet. But I'm like 63-0-94
Holy
in 5 games.
That's awesome. That's kicking butt, man. I think my original title for this, if we weren't gonna have the guest, was like, some of us are getting it, some of us aren't, right? And because I think you posted that in the Discord, and you were just like kicking butt. It was awesome.
Oh yeah, that was the first game. Since then, I've gotten like 16-0-20. I have yet to die. Like 16-0-21, 18-0-23. Like
Right?
You should take those gifted subs and put them into the Pokemon MOBA that's like pay to win.
Oh,
Oh.
yeah.
Ah.
Right.
Just kidding.
Be a
Don't do
Unite
that.
stream.
Well, I mean, I wish it just wasn't for only Switch. I think it's only on Switch.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
only
it
on Switch.
is? Oh, I didn't
Mhm.
know that.
Yeah.
I thought they
Yeah,
were
no
talking about
PC.
expanding it to phone as well, weren't they?
Yeah, I think they are.
Yeah,
But
no,
as for now, it's only live on Switch.
yeah.
But
Yeah, well,
Tyler, saying you play Smite all the time. Hop in the Discord. I'm sure you and Krios could make a hell of a duo lane. Or heck of a
mhm.
Oh,
team
yeah.
combo.
Guan Yu, man, that's my
Yeah.
boy.
Guan Yu. Oh yeah, I love Guan Yu.
And I think we were missing like one person. Like, weren't we? We were running one person down. So last week. So even if you're not on
yeah,
stream,
sorry.
we'd
I
love
was
to
off.
have you still play. You know.
So I think I'm the only one here from the Midwest. You all need to. I'm infecting you all with the Midwest goodbye, where we just keep going on and on.
Right.
Yeah.
Other than the
It
Irish
is,
goodbye where you
yep.
just drop out.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you again, Haley, for being here.
Thank
Catch
you
us
so much.
again next week for our Mental Health Monday, where we continue talking about PTSD and then in our PTSD series. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks,
Yeah.
guys.
Night,
Night,
everybody.
y'all.
Peace and
Good
love.
night.